What it would feel like if humanity suddenly realized it was not the apex of the universe, but merely a fragile spark trembling against a storm that spans galaxies. Imagine a day when the skies themselves fracture, not with clouds or storms, but with the machinery of gods, ancient, unstoppable, terrifying. This is the day the imperium of man arrived in our universe. The first signs were subtle. Satellites vanished, replaced by anomalies that defied the laws of physics. Electromagnetic pulses rippled across continents, silencing communications and throwing cities into darkness. Astronomers watching the night sky noted strange, geometrically impossible stars shifting positions, as though the universe itself was bending in anticipation of something monumental. And then they came, colossal void ships, black and bristling with weaponry that made our most powerful missiles seem like children's toys. Their arrival was silent, but in its silence lay a warning deeper than any scream. This universe, until that moment, had believed itself stable, predictable, safe. Humanity had learned the language of atoms and the patterns of planets, and yet, in the span of one heartbeat, all our knowledge became insignificant. The Imperium's ships hung in orbit, casting shadows across continents, and from their decks descended the first emissaries, the Adeptus Astartes, space marines, genetically perfected warriors clad in ceramite armor that gleamed with an almost holy menace. They walked among our cities, not as invaders seeking to conquer in the traditional sense, but as judges of a species they deemed young, fragile, and untested. Who were they? Where did they come from? And why had they arrived here in our universe with its fragile physics and unprepared inhabitants? To understand their coming, one must first understand where the Imperium of Man originates. Warhammer 40,000, the grimdark universe from which they came, was born in the 1980, from the minds of visionaries seeking a world both familiar and alien, a future where humanity's grandeur was mirrored by its inevitable decay. Games Workshop, the creators of this universe, imagined not just battles and heroes, but the crushing weight of endless war, the corruption of power, and the insignificance of mortal life in the face of the infinite. Within this universe, the Imperium of Man had survived tens of thousands of years of unceasing conflict, teetering on the brink of annihilation at every turn, yet clinging to life with religious fervor, iron discipline, and the unshakable belief that humanity's destiny lay among the stars. And now, that destiny had spilled over into our reality. The first encounters were brief, terrifying, and incomprehensible. Governments attempted communication, but the language of the Adeptus Astartes was alien not merely in words, but in thought, intent, and purpose. When a squad of ultramarines appeared above New York, clad in blue and gold power armor, citizens reported seeing eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and mind alike. Their leader, a captain named Marius Septimus, spoke through translators, his voice reverberating with authority and something far older than mere human experience. He spoke of duty, of the Emperor of mankind, and of the judgment that awaited those who could not rise to meet the challenges of existence. And then the trials began. Humanity had always feared the unknown, but nothing in our history prepared us for the Adeptus Mechanicus, those priests of machine and flesh who arrived with constructs that defied imagination. Their servitors, humans grafted with machinery, stripped of emotion and individuality, tended the war machines that hummed with power beyond comprehension. Cities became laboratories of impossible experiments. Entire oceans seemed to vanish as the Imperium's terraforming engines reshaped landscapes, preparing the Earth for a version of reality in which survival was no longer guaranteed. It was during these early weeks that we began to understand the nature of the Imperium itself. Unlike any human empire we had known, It was a fusion of faith and military might, where belief was as potent as technology, and where the emperor was not a symbolic figure but a living god whose will shaped entire worlds. Humanity in our universe was chaotic, disorganized, and divided. In their eyes, we were a species on the cusp of annihilation, fragile and untested. They did not merely seek to conquer. They sought to impose a brutal, unyielding order, to forge us into something capable of standing against the horrors that awaited beyond our stars. At first, resistance was instinctive. Militaries mobilized, thinking our advanced weaponry could repel these interstellar giants. But our weapons shattered like glass against their armor. Entire battalions were annihilated in minutes. Even our most sophisticated drones and satellites were rendered useless. The sky became a theater of unending dread. Every human who dared look upward felt the weight of centuries of war, as though the imperium carried with it the memory of countless battles, each one a warning of what awaited those who stood unprepared. Amid the chaos there were stories of bravery, of defiance, of those who faced the impossible and yet refused to yield. In London, a scientist named Eleanor Mays attempted to communicate with the Adeptus Mechanicus, seeking understanding rather than confrontation. She was taken aboard a forge world orbiting Earth within hours, but instead of death, she found herself a pupil learning truths that defied logic. She saw engines powered by the souls of the faithful, machines capable of reshaping matter at will, and archives containing knowledge of the universe so vast it threatened to drive her mind into madness. It was here that humanity's first glimpse of the Imperium's true purpose emerged, not domination for its own sake, but preparation. For what exactly remained unknown. The Imperium did not answer questions lightly. Their doctrine was one of action, judgment, and endless vigilance. And in their presence, the world began to change not just physically, but spiritually. Faith, politics, and morality were tested as never before. Nations that had spent centuries dividing themselves suddenly faced a common reality: survival against a force that did not negotiate, did not compromise, and did not forgive. Then came the whispers, rumors that traveled faster than the armies, faster than the void ships themselves. Strange visions plagued dreams worldwide. People claimed to see stars fall, cities crumble, and figures in ceramite armor walking among them, watching, judging, recording. Some spoke of the warp bleeding into reality, of psychic phenomena that defied science. The Imperium was not merely a physical presence. It was a catalyst, a mirror showing humanity the terrifying truth. Our universe, our very existence, was fragile. And the Imperium's arrival was not just a test of strength, but a test of humanity's soul. By the end of the first month, it became clear that the Imperium would not leave. Its influence was total, reshaping societies, forcing alliances, and crushing resistance with surgical precision. Humanity began to change. Militaries became more disciplined, governments more unified, faiths more fervent. And yet fear lingered, a shadow that stretched across the globe. No one could say what the Adeptus Astartes, or the Emperor, truly wanted. Were we allies, tools, subjects, or simply raw material for a universe-wide crucible? In the quiet moments, when the noise of shattered cities and distant warships faded, some wondered if this arrival was salvation or doom. The Imperium of Man had crossed into our universe not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as architects of a destiny we could scarcely comprehend. The first act of contact had ended, but the real story, the true reckoning, had only begun. And so, the question remained: could humanity rise to meet the Imperium's judgment, or would we be consumed, our universe reshaped by forces we could not hope to understand? The sky darkened once more, and somewhere, in the heart of a world that had not yet surrendered, the first human resistance began to whisper its defiance. But it was a small whisper against a tide of centuries, a murmur against the echo of war that had begun long before we existed, and that would not end with our presence alone. Could humanity, after centuries of petty wars and fleeting triumphs, truly stand against beings who had fought for tens of millennia, whose entire existence was war incarnate? That question haunted the corridors of power as nations scrambled to respond to the imperium's presence. For the first time in history, Earth was united not by diplomacy, but by terror. Leaders met in hastily convened councils, their debates frantic and desperate. Some called for surrender, arguing that resistance was futile. Others, clinging to fragile pride, insisted that the human spirit could defy even the impossible. Yet no argument could erase the stark truth. The imperium did not negotiate, it judged, and its judgment was absolute. From orbit, the Adeptus Astartes observed, their ceramite armor glinting under the sun like the heralds of an ancient god. Captain Marius Septimus led the initial survey squads, walking through our cities not as a conqueror, but as an examiner of potential, a silent arbiter. Civilians whispered of his presence in fear and awe, describing eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and thought, reading not only intentions but the capacity of the soul itself. His voice, when translated through the Mechanicus devices, carried an authority that unsettled even the most steadfast of leaders. Your species teeters on the brink. Your weakness is palpable. Offer no mercy to those who cannot rise. And yet, humanity resisted. Across continents, armies mobilized with desperation bordering on madness. Jets roared into the sky, missiles streaked toward orbiting void ships, and cyberwar, fair experts unleashed viruses and digital strikes, hoping to disrupt the alien vessels. Entire fleets attempted to engage in coordinated attacks, but the Imperium's response was swift, precise, and devastating. A single salvo from a void ship obliterated the naval armadas of Europe in moments, leaving no survivors, no trace of resistance. Cities that attempted to defy them were not bombarded, as one might expect, but reshaped. The ground split, oceans churned, and mountains were altered as though the very planet were being tested for its worthiness. It became horrifyingly clear that the Imperium wielded power that made our greatest technologies appear primitive. Amid the chaos, a human spark of understanding emerged. Elinor Mays, now aboard a Mechanicus Forge world, studied the fusion of flesh and machine, the engines that defied known physics, and the weapons that could reduce continents to ash. Through endless nights, she learned that the Imperium did not simply wage war. It cultivated resilience, discipline, and faith. Every device, every soldier, every psychic conduit was part of a grand design, the preparation of worlds and species for the true horrors lurking beyond the veil of the universe. Elinor began to grasp that resistance without understanding was not courage, it was suicide. Humanity's first contact with the warp came soon after. Strange visions plagued soldiers in battle, psychic phenomena erupted unpredictably, and the sky itself seemed to ripple and convulse, as if reality were tearing at its seams. Some claimed to see figures of light and shadow, others heard voices speaking in tongues that were not human, warnings that chilled the mind. The Imperium, however, moved with methodical control. Psychers aboard their vessels stabilized the warp anomalies, bending the unpredictable energies into instruments of both exploration and destruction. Humanity, untrained and unprepared, was left scrambling, exposed to forces it could neither predict nor comprehend. Resistance movements began to form in pockets across the globe, led by generals and scientists who refused to bow, even as their armies were shattered. In Moscow, A young commander named Alexei Volkov rallied survivors of a decimated mechanized corps, insisting that strategy and cunning could offset raw power. In Brazil, a coalition of engineers and ex-military officers devised countermeasures against the Imperium's terraforming engines, attempting to sabotage their operations on a planetary scale. Yet every act of defiance came at an unbearable cost. Entire cities were sacrificed, civilians caught in the sweep of war machines, leaving the survivors to question whether resistance was noble or merely a delay of the inevitable. It was during one such raid on a Mechanicus research site that humanity glimpsed the terrifying perfection of the Imperium's methods. Volkov's strike team infiltrated the perimeter, believing that stealth and speed could yield victory. They found not a simple garrison, but a living factory where human bodies and machine were fused into servitors, cybernetic beings stripped of free will, yet capable of superhuman precision. The soldiers watched in horror as the servitors moved with inhuman coordination, repairing, recalibrating, and maintaining weapons capable of obliterating entire cities. The raid ended in catastrophe. Few escaped. Those who survived returned with stories that sounded insane tales of technology fused with religion, engines powered by devotion, and an empire so vast that time itself seemed irrelevant. Back aboard the orbiting void ships, Captain Septimus observed these events with an unsettling calm. The Imperium did not celebrate victories, nor did it mourn the casualties of war. Every encounter was data, every resistance measured for its worth, every human action analyzed to determine potential. Septimus' reports to the Emperor's proxies were meticulous. This species is flawed, yet capable. They fracture easily under pressure. Their resilience is intermittent. They will either adapt or perish, and through these reports, it became clear. The Imperium had not come to dominate for conquest alone. It had come to test humanity, to determine if our species could endure the coming darkness that awaited all life across the multiverse. The world changed. Governments lost their pretenses, religions shifted in tone, and human priorities narrowed to survival. Technology, once celebrated for exploration and comfort, became a weapon and a shield. Cities built walls not against other nations, but against the judgment of an empire whose soldiers were nearer to gods than men. Entire populations adapted, learned, or vanished. Every corner of the globe became a battlefield for knowledge, faith, and survival. And yet, amid despair, a glimmer of hope persisted. Elinor Mays began to understand the inner workings of the Mechanicus, documenting weaknesses, patterns, and philosophies that might be exploited. Volkov's resistance cells discovered methods to slow the Imperium's progress, even if they could not hope to defeat them outright. Small victories, insignificant on a cosmic scale, became symbols, a reminder that humanity's spirit, though fragile, was not extinguished. But even as hope flickered, a deeper, more terrifying truth became undeniable. The Imperium's arrival was not a singular event, not a temporary incursion. Its presence signaled the opening of a door, a bridge between universes, a path for forces that humanity could scarcely imagine. The Adeptus Astartes were not just warriors. They were custodians, guardians against horrors that had already devoured countless civilizations. The warp, once a distant abstraction, now bled into reality, carrying with it entities of unimaginable malevolence. And as Earth trembled beneath the weight of incomprehensible power, one question echoed louder than all others. If the Imperium had come to test us, what awaited beyond that test? The first major battle between human resistance and the Adeptus Astartes was inevitable. And as the first volleys were fired, as the first psychic storms roared across continents, it became clear that survival alone would not be enough. Humanity had to evolve, adapt, and endure, or be annihilated, leaving nothing but a warning for the next universe that dared stand against the Imperium. In the shadows of shattered cities and war-torn skies, a single thought lingered in the minds of those who survived the first month of contact. This was only the beginning, and the true reckoning, the one that would determine the fate of our universe, was yet to come. What does it mean to fight an enemy that is not merely stronger, but older, wiser, and utterly indifferent to your existence? Humanity discovered the answer on the first day of full-scale engagement with the Imperium of Man. The skies above Europe, once familiar and calm, were now a storm of steel, fire, and psychic resonance. Missiles streaked upward, only to be torn apart mid-flight by invisible forces, their explosions absorbed or redirected by the void ships that hung in orbit like celestial predators. Below, armies clashed, not with the rhythm of strategy, but with the raw, terrifying precision of machines perfected over millennia. Captain Marius Septimus led the initial wave, his presence in battle more than symbolic. The Adeptus Astartes moved like a tide of judgment, each strike calculated, each maneuver flawless. Cities that dared resist were leveled not out of vengeance, but as a demonstration of capability. Entire battalions of human soldiers, trained for decades in warfare, were cut down in moments. Their weapons, powerful though they were, barely scratched the ceramite armor of the Space Marines. It became horrifyingly clear that humanity's conventional methods of defense were meaningless. Survival required understanding, adaptation, and sacrifice on a scale previously unimagined. In New York, Alexei Volkov orchestrated what he hoped would be a strategic counterattack, gathering remnants of shattered military units and civilian volunteers. He moved with urgency, trying to coordinate a defense that might slow the Imperium's advance. Yet even as his forces engaged, the Imperium's power revealed its complexity. Mechanicus constructs, massive war engines infused with both flesh and machine, descended into the city streets, reshaping buildings into fortifications, converting civilians into servitors, and converting energy sources into weapons that radiated destructive power. The human resistance fought bravely, but bravery alone was insufficient. Elinor Mays, still aboard the Forge World, continued her studies, now gaining insight into the warp's influence on this universe. She discovered that the Imperium's technology was not merely mechanical, but intertwined with psychic forces, drawing upon the raw energy of faith, devotion, and belief. This fusion of science and mysticism allowed the Adeptus Astartes and Mechanicus to perform feats that defied the known laws of physics. Engines that should have been impossible hummed with power, void shields bent space, and psychic wards protected entire sectors from destruction. Humanity faced an enemy that operated on a scale of understanding beyond comprehension. As battles raged, warp phenomena intensified. Psychic storms erupted unpredictably across the globe, twisting reality itself. Soldiers reported seeing hallucinations so vivid they could not distinguish them from reality, visions of cities collapsing into nothingness, oceans boiling, and monstrous entities tearing through the sky. Entire populations panicked, fleeing as if possessed by an unseen hand. Yet the Imperium moved with unshakable calm. Psychers aboard their ships stabilized the storms, converting chaos into a weapon for judgment, turning the warp into an instrument of both terror and precision. Volkov and Mays realized that understanding alone would not save humanity. They needed to find the patterns behind the Imperium's methods, to anticipate their judgment, and to exploit weaknesses before total annihilation occurred. Elinor deciphered the logic of the Mechanicus, noting that while their processes were nearly perfect, they required time, devotion, and energy. Even the Adeptus Astartes, unstoppable as they seemed, were bound by their code, by rituals, and by the limitations of flesh and machine. Humanity's survival depended on ingenuity and adaptation, on exploiting what the Imperium overlooked in its quest for order. The philosophical clash became apparent in those moments of fleeting success. Humans fought not only for survival, but for choice, the right to determine their own fate, however fragile it might be. The Imperium, in contrast, operated under the absolute certainty that the Emperor's will and the demands of survival justified any measure. Where humans hesitated, questioned, or doubted, the Imperium acted with brutal decisiveness. The tension between free will and order became a battlefield as real and as deadly as any street or battlefield. In London, a psychic storm ripped through the city, lifting debris into the sky, bending buildings into impossible angles, and causing mass hysteria. Volkov's forces attempted to stabilize the situation with technology and human coordination, but every effort seemed laughably insufficient. And yet, amidst the chaos, Eleanor's insights allowed small victories. She guided sabotage teams to disrupt Mechanicus engines, delaying terraforming efforts and buying precious time for human survivors. Every minor success, though fleeting, became a symbol of resistance, a flicker of hope against overwhelming inevitability. Captain Septimus observed these human attempts with a mixture of analytical curiosity and cold judgment. The Imperium did not hate humanity. It simply evaluated its potential. Each act of resistance, each display of ingenuity, each spark of defiance was recorded, analyzed, and incorporated into the Imperium's understanding of our species. They were measuring, not punishing, yet the consequences were always catastrophic. Cities were reshaped, populations decimated, and the few who survived carried the burden of knowledge that their triumphs were fleeting. The first major psychic confrontation occurred when a human psyker, untrained and desperate, attempted to strike at a Mechanicus stronghold. The resulting backlash was catastrophic. Reality fractured around the site, a storm of raw warp energy that consumed everything in its path. It became clear that the warp was both weapon and threat, and that humanity's unpreparedness made it dangerously susceptible to forces the Imperium commanded with terrifying expertise. The survivors of the storm spoke of visions so horrifying they could not be described, of entities that seemed aware, watching, and judging, yet utterly indifferent to mortal suffering. As the battle for Earth escalated, the larger truth of the Imperium's purpose became undeniable. This was not merely conquest, it was preparation. Humanity was being tested, measured against impossible odds, forced to adapt or perish. The Adeptus Astartes and Mechanicus were not the end of the threat. They were the gatekeepers, guardians of knowledge and power that had been forged across galaxies, civilizations, and millennia. The question looming over the surviving humans was no longer whether they could survive the Imperia. It was whether they could endure the horrors beyond, horrors that had already consumed countless worlds. Amidst shattered cities and the roar of impossible weapons, a fragile coalition began to form among humanity's scattered survivors. Volkov, Eleanor, and a handful of leaders realized that survival required unity, strategy, and the courage to face forces that could not be understood. They began to map the Imperium's movements, study their tactics, and prepare for the next stage of confrontation. Every step was perilous, every decision fatal if misjudged. Yet, for the first time since the arrival of the Imperium, there was a glimmer of controlled defiance, a recognition that even against gods, humanity could attempt to assert its will. And as Earth trembled beneath the weight of alien judgment, as warp storms raged and cities fell, one truth became painfully clear. This universe was no longer ours alone. The Imperium had arrived, and with it came a reckoning that would test every fiber of human resilience. The clash of worlds had begun, and the consequences would echo across the cosmos, far beyond the comprehension of any mortal mind. The first act of war between humanity and the Imperium had ended, but the real confrontation, the one that would determine the fate of the human race, was only beginning. The question remained, could humanity evolve fast enough, adapt deep enough, and endure long enough to survive the judgment of a godlike empire? Or would we be swept aside, our universe forever reshaped by forces beyond comprehension? What does it cost to defy a force that has endured tens of thousands of years, a force that sees the span of civilizations as mere moments, and yet judges every choice, every thought, and every hesitation? Humanity began to learn that cost in the weeks following the first clashes with the imperium of man. The world, once familiar and ordered, was now a canvas for impossible engineering, psychic storms, and relentless evaluation. Mountains were reshaped, oceans diverted, cities hollowed for study, and humans themselves measured as though they were nothing more than specimens in a vast, cosmic laboratory. Alexei Volkov, now recognized among scattered human survivors as a central figure of resistance, convened what remained of the global military command. Their discussions, held in underground bunkers and makeshift command centers, were not about strategy alone. They were about morality, psychology, and survival under conditions that defied comprehension. Each plan considered not only the Imperium's overwhelming firepower, but the invisible, psychological pressure of being constantly judged by beings who viewed life itself as a tool. Volkov spoke often of hope, though his voice was tempered with grim realism. Survival would demand sacrifice, cunning, and, above all, the understanding that humanity was being tested, not merely attacked. Elinor Mays, still aboard the Mechanicus Forge world, began to uncover something chilling. The Imperium's methods were not random, and its brutality was not arbitrary. Every act of judgment, every destruction of cities, and every psychic shock was calculated to probe human potential, to observe reactions, and to measure adaptability under extreme conditions. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in particular, treated knowledge as a weapon and humanity as an unshaped alloy. Machines powered by devotion and flesh, engines that bent the universe to their will, and constructs that seemed sentient all served a singular purpose: to assess whether humans could endure. Impossible. Elinor realized that understanding this logic was the first step toward survival, yet each revelation came at a terrifying cost to her psyche. As the Imperium's influence spread, warp phenomena intensified. Storms of psychic energy tore through continents. Cities vanished into rifts where reality itself was unmade, and survivors reported visions so vivid they became permanent scars on the mind. Entire populations experienced unprovoked hysteria, hallucinations of colossal, alien beings, and the sensation of unseen eyes watching, judging, and recording every action. The Imperium, however, moved with deliberate calm. Psychers aboard their void ships stabilized chaotic energies, converting destruction into precise tools of evaluation. It became horrifyingly clear. These were not merely weapons, but instruments of cosmic pedagogy, and humanity was their unwitting student. In one desperate attempt to turn the tide, Volkov orchestrated a global counteroffensive. Communications networks coordinated surviving military units across continents, deploying saboteurs, guerrilla fighters, and improvised psychic operatives. Targets included Mechanicus forges, Adeptus Astartes deployment zones, and warp-touched anomalies. Small victories were achieved, engines were damaged, supply lines disrupted, and some servitors were destroyed, but each success was overshadowed by catastrophic retaliation. Entire regions were quarantined, populations forcibly relocated, and the surviving humans began to understand that their resistance was not merely against soldiers, but against the very logic of an empire forged in the fires of unending war. Psychological strain became a silent killer. Humans, unprepared for the scale and philosophy of the imperium, began to fracture under pressure. Soldiers suffered from nightmares so vivid they could not distinguish reality. Commanders hesitated under impossible scrutiny. Civilians experienced spontaneous psychic phenomena that often resulted in death or madness. The imperium, ever observant, catalogued every reaction, every failure, and every adaptation. Humanity was being tested in body, mind, and spirit. Elinar's studies revealed something extraordinary. The imperium's technology was powered not just by mechanics and energy, but by belief. Faith, loyalty, and devotion, whether to the emperor or to purpose itself, could amplify power in ways incomprehensible to humans. It became clear that to survive, humanity would need not only weapons and strategy, but a profound collective will, a unity that went beyond politics, religion, or nationality. Every act of courage, defiance, and ingenuity was measured as potential, and the failure to act or to hesitate was equally noted. Amid these grim revelations, small pockets of human ingenuity persisted. Resistance cells discovered methods to exploit predictable patterns in the Mechanicus routines. Improvised psychic operatives learned to navigate minor warp disturbances, turning chaos into opportunity. Engineers began to reverse, engineer captured components, creating devices capable of interfering with servitor operations. Each victory was minute, almost insignificant in the cosmic scale of the Imperium, yet it instilled a fragile hope. Humanity's resilience was being shaped, and in the crucible of suffering, some began to glimpse the outlines of a possible survival strategy. But hope was dangerous. The Imperium's response was not swift vengeance, but calculated pressure. Entire populations were subjected to psychic and physical trials designed to test adaptation under duress. Cities were reshaped into arenas of evaluation, and those who survived were left to ponder the meaning of their endurance. Captain Septimus observed these outcomes with measured detachment. Humans, he noted in his reports, displayed unpredictable patterns of resilience, sometimes collapsing under pressure, other times finding strength in desperation. The Imperium's task was not to destroy humanity outright, but to force evolution under fire, to temper a species that might one day stand against horrors the likes of which our universe had never seen. In one particularly harrowing incident, a resistance cell led by Volkov attempted to sabotage a Mechanicus warp conduit. The operation was initially successful, causing a localized psychic storm that annihilated a Mechanicus garrison. Yet the storm spiraled beyond control, consuming entire urban districts and leaving survivors psychologically shattered. The Imperium's assessment was ruthless. Humans could adapt and succeed, but every misstep carried consequences that were permanent, brutal, and inescapable. The lesson was clear: success could prolong life, but failure ensured suffering and death. As Earth continued to fracture beneath the dual weight of alien judgment and warp phenomena, Elinar realized the terrifying reality of the Imperium's arrival. They were not conquerors in traditional sense, nor were they benevolent allies. They were arbiters of a cosmic trial, shaping humanity not for conquest, but for endurance. And in that endurance lay the only hope of survival. Humans would have to learn to act with precision, discipline, and unity, or perish under the indifferent scrutiny of an empire that measured everything from faith to fear, as data points in an experiment spanning galaxies. What defines humanity when the universe itself becomes an enemy, when the laws of reality bend, and when judgment descends in armor heavier than steel and older than time? That question no longer belonged to philosophers or scholars. It belonged to every man, woman, and child struggling to survive beneath the shadow of the imperium of man. By now, the world had fractured. Governments were shadows of their former selves, militaries reduced to scattered factions, and civilians organized into survivalist communities guided by leaders who had learned that hesitation was as deadly as any weapon. Alexei Volkov had emerged as a symbol of resistance. The failures of conventional militaries had taught him one unassailable truth: brute force alone could not withstand the imperium. Strategy, deception, and adaptability were the only weapons left. He coordinated a tenuous global network of resistance cells, connecting survivors across continents through encrypted communications, improvised psychic links, and stolen Mechanicus tech. Each mission was a gamble. Every action was scrutinized by the Adeptus Astartes, their observation networks penetrating even the most hidden refuges. Resistance, Volkov realized, was not about victory, it was about endurance. Eleanor Mays, having decoded deeper Mechanicus logic, became the linchpin of human adaptation. She discovered that the Imperium's processes were deeply ritualized, their technology intertwined with belief systems, and their psychic infrastructure structured to maintain control over both machine and mind. By understanding the patterns of devotion and the protocols of judgment, humans could predict responses, delay attacks, and, in rare instances, exploit weaknesses. Yet each revelation carried a psychological cost. Eleanor's nights were haunted by visions of the warp, of entities that defied the mind, and of the Emperor himself, a presence at once incomprehensible and intimately aware of every human thought. The warp, long a distant abstraction in human understanding, now tore into reality with relentless ferocity. Entire regions were subject to psychic storms, reality fractures that could swallow cities, and phenomena that made survival nearly impossible. Humans who survived these storms often returned with fragmented minds, visions of alien geometries, or inexplicable psychic abilities. Some became prophets, others deranged messengers. The Imperium observed all, cataloging human responses, testing resilience, and determining which individuals and societies could endure the crucible. Humanity itself had become an experiment, its very evolution under observation. The first coordinated human offensive was daring but flawed. Resistance cells in Asia and South America launched simultaneous strikes against Mechanicus installations, using improvised devices designed to disrupt energy conduits and communications. For hours, minor victories gave survivors hope. Engines faltered, servitors malfunctioned, and human ingenuity seemed to matter. But the Imperium's response was both predictable and horrifyingly precise. Psychers aboard void ships channeled warp energy not merely to annihilate, but to test reactions. Cities were spared wholesale destruction, but humans were pushed to the brink, forced to confront terror, uncertainty, and their own mortality. The Imperium measured what humans endured, cataloging adaptability, resilience, and willpower. Captain Marius Septimus, observing from orbit, saw patterns emerge in human behavior. "They are fragile, yet persistent," he reported. "Their victories are fleeting, yet they reveal sparks of potential. They may endure, but only under relentless pressure. The crucible begins in earnest." His words, transmitted through Mechanicus networks, reflected a truth that humans were only beginning to grasp. Endurance was more valuable than destruction. Survival depended on learning, evolving, and understanding not only the Imperium, but the universe that awaited beyond. Across Europe, Volkov's forces attempted a desperate maneuver. the use of psychic operatives to manipulate localized warp storms, turning chaos into a weapon. Some succeeded, others failed catastrophically, tearing themselves apart or unleashing forces that consumed entire districts. Each act of courage, ingenuity, or desperation was both proof of human potential and a reminder of mortality. Elinor watched from the Forge world as data streamed in. Humans adapting, evolving, failing, and occasionally rarely succeeding in ways the Imperium had not anticipated. Every success, however small, was a testament to human resilience, but also a harbinger of the escalating trials to come. The Imperium's judgment extended beyond physical destruction. Humanity was being tested morally, spiritually, and intellectually. Decisions made in moments of fear carried consequences that could ripple across continents. Leaders were forced to choose between survival and sacrifice, between action and hesitation, and each choice was weighed against an unfathomable standard. The Adeptus Astartes did not judge out of cruelty. They judged because endurance required discernment. Every human action, from defiance to despair, was noted, recorded, and analyzed. By now, humans began to understand the scale of the Imperium's purpose. It was not conquest for conquest's sake. It was preparation, a shaping of a species for trials that spanned universes. Every battle, every failure, every minor success served to temper humanity, to refine resilience, and to expose the flaws that could not withstand the horrors lurking beyond known reality. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in particular, wielded technology as both a tool and a lesson, teaching through demonstration and measurement, revealing possibilities even as they enforced the boundaries of survival. Amid this crucible, a grim sense of unity emerged. Humans, once divided by nationality, ideology, and belief, began to coordinate in unprecedented ways. Psychological warfare, improvised engineering, and guerrilla tactics became the tools of survival. Small victories, though fleeting, were celebrated not as triumphs over the Imperium, but as evidence that humanity could endure. Yet each act of defiance was a double-edged sword. Success meant survival, but failure brought annihilation, both physical and mental. The warp's influence continued to expand. Storms erupted unpredictably, rifts tore through cities, and psychic phenomena manifested with increasing frequency. Humans discovered that even the smallest acts of ingenuity could inadvertently provoke catastrophe. A single misstep in understanding the warp could lead to entire districts vanishing, consumed by energies that no mind could fully comprehend. The Imperium, ever vigilant, observed, corrected, and guided outcomes, their judgment precise and unrelenting. Humanity was learning the cost of existence in a universe reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. And through it all, one constant remained: the Emperor's will, transmitted through proxies, psychers, and the Adeptus Astartes, weighed upon every decision, every survival effort, every act of defiance. The question that haunted survivors was no longer whether they could fight back. It was whether they could endure, evolve, and survive in a crucible that measured not only strength, but spirit, ingenuity, and moral resolve. What happens when the very fabric of reality begins to unravel, when the universe itself becomes a battlefield, and every decision carries consequences that ripple through time and space? Humanity discovered that truth in the 6th month of the Imperium's presence. The warp, once a distant abstraction, now pressed into the world like a living, breathing entity. Storms of psychic energy tore cities apart. Visions of impossible geometries filled the minds of survivors, and entire continents seemed to tremble under unseen weight. This was no longer war in the conventional sense. This was a test of existence itself. Alexei Volkov had grown into a leader tempered by despair and resolve. He coordinated resistance efforts with ruthless precision, understanding that survival required both strategy and psychological endurance. Entire networks of human operatives moved across continents, navigating warp, affected zones, and mechanicus surveillance. Every operation was a high-stakes gamble. Lives were expendable in the calculation, but each success, however small, was a vital step in teaching humanity how to endure. Volkov had learned that brute force could no longer achieve victory. Only adaptation, cunning, and resilience could keep humanity alive. Elinor Mays had uncovered an even darker revelation. The Imperium's presence had amplified the warp in our universe, creating corridors of psychic instability that could tear matter and mind alike. Humans who ventured into these zones without guidance were often lost, consumed by visions that made reality impossible to comprehend. Others emerged transformed, gifted with abilities beyond human understanding, or driven mad by what they saw. The warp was a test, a crucible of psychic and spiritual endurance, and the Imperium wielded it with terrifying mastery. Elinor realized that understanding the warp was no longer optional. It was the difference between survival and annihilation. Captain Marius Septimus and his squads of Adeptus Astartes became increasingly involved in direct observation of human resilience. They moved among cities in calculated strikes, not to destroy indiscriminately, but to probe human reactions. Each encounter measured courage, ingenuity, and the capacity to endure under overwhelming pressure. Entire districts were reshaped in these tests, and the survivors were left with both knowledge and trauma. Septimus noted in his reports, "Their species is unpredictable, yet capable. Each action, each choice, reveals latent potential. They may yet endure, but only if the crucible continues unrelenting." Amid the chaos, small pockets of human ingenuity persisted. Resistance cells experimented with warp-tuned devices, psychic amplifiers, and mechanicus reverse engineering. These experiments occasionally succeeded, allowing operatives to navigate storms or disable minor installations. Yet the Imperium responded not with anger, but with meticulous correction. Systems were rebuilt, errors were exploited to teach lessons, and humans learned that survival required understanding patterns, not merely brute strength. Each failure carried consequences of devastating magnitude, reinforcing the stakes. The warp began to manifest in increasingly personal ways. Survivors reported dreams so vivid they could not differentiate them from reality. Children saw visions of alien civilizations devoured by unknown entities. Soldiers experienced temporal distortions, seeing events before they occurred or witnessing themselves fail in ways that would never happen in physical reality. The Imperium observed these manifestations with clinical interest. Every human thought, fear, and hope was catalogued as part of the assessment. Humanity itself had become a living experiment, and the test was now as much psychological as it was physical. In one particularly harrowing episode, Volkov's forces attempted to harness a localized warp storm to repel a mechanicus assault. The operation initially succeeded, allowing temporary evacuation of civilians and sabotage of a key installation. But the storm spiraled beyond control, engulfing neighboring cities and leaving survivors mentally scarred. Elinor documented the event meticulously. Humans could manipulate the warp, but only if they respected its alien logic and unpredictable nature. Otherwise, it consumed all. Each human success was a lesson, each failure a warning. The universe was no longer a place of rules humans understood, but a crucible for adaptation, endurance, and survival. The Imperium's philosophy became increasingly evident. Survival required obedience to laws older than human memory, discipline forged in unending war, and devotion to principles that transcended individual will. Captain Septimus, observing humans under duress, noted patterns of resilience and failure. They are flawed, he recorded, yet sparks of potential exist. They must endure, or they will perish. The judgment of the Imperium was not cruel. It was absolute, and it demanded evolution through suffering, adaptation, and understanding. Humanity's free will was tested at every turn, measured against a standard forged across galaxies and millennia. Yet amid despair, humanity found glimpses of hope. Resistance networks learned to coordinate. Psychic operatives discovered ways to stabilize zones temporarily, and some individuals began to harness minor warp phenomena to their advantage. These small victories became symbols, proof that the human spirit, fragile though it was, could endure. Each success, though fleeting, revealed the potential to navigate the impossible, to survive the judgment of an empire older than time. What becomes of a species when it stands at the edge of extinction, staring into the eyes of gods who have known the deaths of countless worlds? Humanity had endured more than half a year of relentless trials. Cities had fallen and risen again, continents had been reshaped by alien technology, and the warp had bled into reality with terrifying consequences. Yet, against all odds, humans had learned to adapt. They had discovered small victories in the midst of devastation, found ingenuity in desperation, and glimpsed hope amid unending judgment. But the ultimate test, the one that would determine whether humanity would survive the Imperium's crucible, had finally arrived. Alexei Volkov stood at the command center of the last fortified human bastion in Europe, a city now a hybrid of human engineering and partially salvaged Mechanicus machinery. His eyes scanned data feeds showing psychic storms forming over the Pacific, Mechanicus engines orbiting every major landmass, and the movement of Adeptus Astartes squads methodically assessing human enclaves. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as it had never before. Every decision mattered, not only for the immediate survival of his people, but for the very future of humanity in a universe now ruled by rules far beyond mortal comprehension. Elinor Mays, now fully integrated into the Imperium systems through her study of Mechanicus technology and warp phenomena, had discovered the final pattern. The Imperium's tests were converging on a single point: humanity itself. Every warp storm, every psychic disturbance, every engagement had been designed to measure the species' adaptability, resilience, and moral coherence under unrelenting pressure. Now, the Adeptus Astartes and Mechanicus forces were preparing the ultimate assessment, a global crucible that would determine whether humanity could survive not only as a species, but as a participant in the cosmic order the Imperium maintained. The crucible began with psychic storms tearing across continents simultaneously. Cities vanished into rifts, entire landscapes became unrecognizable, and the survivors were tested in ways that defied human comprehension. Yet humanity had evolved. Humans now coordinated through psychic channels, improvised devices stabilized localized warp zones, and Volkov's strategic networks anticipated and countered Mechanicus manipulations. Small victories, hard, won and bloody, had created a foundation for survival. Humanity had learned to endure, adapt, and act with precision, even under impossible circumstances. Captain Marius Septimus observed the events with the calm of an entity whose judgment had been forged across millennia. He saw humans rise, falter, and rise again. Every act of courage, ingenuity, and moral determination was catalogued. For the first time, he noted something unexpected: sparks of potential that rivaled even the most disciplined recruits of the Adeptus Astartes. Humanity was evolving under fire, and the Crucible was proving not only a test of endurance, but a forge for potential greatness. As the global psychic storm reached its zenith, Elinor Mays guided a coordinated operation that channeled warp energy into stabilizing critical human settlements. The effort was unprecedented. Cities that should have been obliterated survived, protected by human ingenuity and the careful manipulation of forces that even the Imperium treated with caution. Survivors began to witness the incomprehensible, the warp bending to human will, however briefly, a testament to the species' growing understanding of its place in the universe. The final confrontation came in orbit above Earth. Volkov, Elinor, and a contingent of human psychic operatives launched a daring maneuver to disrupt the primary Mechanicus warp conduit. Their goal was not destruction, but demonstration proof that humanity could act with precision, intelligence, and unity. The Adeptus Astartes engaged, testing human coordination and resolve, while Mechanicus constructs adapted, pushing humans to the edge. In those moments, every decision, every hesitation, every act of courage mattered. The outcome would not merely determine survival, it would define humanity's role in the Imperium's vision of the cosmos. The operation succeeded, but at a tremendous cost. Cities were lost, millions perished, and the psychic toll left survivors physically and mentally scarred. Yet, the Imperium recognized the achievement. Humanity had proven itself capable of adaptation, resilience, and moral coherence under pressure. Captain Septimus reported, "The species demonstrates potential sufficient to endure. They are flawed, yet capable. Judgment is complete, but the Crucible continues." The Adeptus Astartes withdrew from active engagement, leaving humanity to rebuild under the watchful eye of the Mechanicus, not as conquered subjects, but as participants in an ongoing experiment, guardians of their own future within the greater cosmic order. In the aftermath, Earth bore the scars of trial and judgment. Entire continents had been reshaped, cities had vanished, and populations had been irrevocably altered. The warp continued to ripple, though more predictably, reflecting humanity's evolving understanding. Volkov addressed the remaining humans. Survival was no longer guaranteed, but humanity had earned a place in a universe far larger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Every choice henceforth carried weight, every action held consequence, but the species had endured. Elinor Mays, reflecting on her journey, realized the paradox of the Imperium's presence. What had arrived as an invincible force of judgment had also become a teacher. Humanity had been tested, broken, and reshaped, but in the Crucible it had found its potential. The cost had been unimaginable, yet the lesson was clear. Endurance, adaptation, and unity were not merely strategies. They were the essence of survival in a universe where the stakes were infinite and the consequences eternal. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the storms had calmed and the Adeptus Astartes observed from orbit, one question lingered. A question that would not be answered for centuries. If humanity had endured this trial, could it endure what lay beyond, in a universe where the Imperium's judgment was but the first of countless challenges?